can you hear me? I'm very delighted to be here. I'd like to thank the African American Heritage House for hosting me on this day. And I have to make sure I don't stand too close. So I want to take you on a journey through your mind, through the city of Charlotte and through a couple of cemeteries. Now, you might think that's a little bit morbid, but I have a method to the madness of showing you how peace and community relations can evolve from these particular sites. So let's get started. As we stand just a few days from America's 249th anniversary, the story of our country's rise to prominence and power will be celebrated across the nation. I'm pretty sure here as well. However, for many people in America, the 4th of July is a holiday complicated by the history of chattel slavery. The history of slavery and its physical manifestations are still very much present, and they actually are part of American cities. The city of Charlotte is a case in point. I moved to Charlotte almost 20 years ago from Detroit. And when I got to Charlotte, I was very much awakened by the present realities and remnants of not just the Civil War, but of slavery. The most extraordinary encounter that I had with the city's history of slavery was in the backyard of a house nestled on a most plain and obscure street. The small home was painted in faded white, and it sat conspicuously or inconspicuously on a suburban road. It was the home of Sadie. I have changed her name to keep her privacy. Sadie is a long-life Presbyterian and a member of one of the city's oldest and most prominent churches. As one walks up to Sadie's house, large oval-shaped field stones greet the eye. They straddle both sides of her walkway, and as you wind around to the back of the house, they populate more and more on the side of her driveway. As the gravel road continues, one is struck by a 19th century structure. It's actually a chapel for enslaved people that still stands. It's in her backyard. As I am struck, as I walk through and recognize this chapel, she tells me it was a chapel established by her great-great-grandfather, who owned enslaved people but wanted his enslaved population to worship on the land. She now has turned that structure into a quasi-shed. But around that structure are more and more field stones, huge, very oval in shape. Because I study African American religion and history, I know that the ways in which those stones are shaped are indicative of enslaved people shaping stones through the eyes of their ancestors. Oval stones are shaped that way because they wanted the ancestors to watch over their loved ones and help them find their way back to Africa. And now I'm standing in a backyard full of over 200 of these stones, almost 6 and 7 feet long and 5 feet wide. At 90 years of age, Sadie is the oldest living descendant of this plantation family. And she tells me another story that each of her grandparents and even her mother and father charged her with protecting the property and protecting the souls that lie in those graves. She considers that her sacred duty. I must admit to you, I was quite astounded to find a house in the middle of a slave cemetery. And I was even more astounded that there was a chapel that was still standing, albeit without a steeple. Now, Sadie has invited me many times to see her home, and she tells me of her charge to care for the lot, and she also tells me of her troubles. Charlotte is a busy city, and it's always creating new development, and so she sold part of her land to a developer, and so now apartments are encroaching more and more closely to those field stones. Because the property that she lives on is going to be bequeathed to her daughter, that chapel and those graves might still be preserved. If her daughter does not take her property, then there are some relatives in her family that will sell it to those developers. Now, that's the usual thing in the city of Charlotte. So what I really want to talk to you about is the ways in which Sadie's backyard is indicative of most American cities, that the remnants of slavery are still hidden in plain sight. And they are also tied to Christianity, to the spaces and places of people who practice Christianity and the institutional structures of Christianity. So I think it's important now that I tell you a word about my positionality, because I'm going to critique Christianity pretty hard here. As an ordained Presbyterian minister and a critical thinker of religion, Christianity has been foundational to my ontology and cosmology. The religion has framed the theological and critical lens I have brought to my teaching, research, and scholarship. My most recent publication, Race, Religion, and the Pulpit, explores the intersections between race, institutional Christianity, and the development of political power structures in urban areas, especially in the interwar years. My first book talked about Henry Ford and his relationship to the Black church. And I was curious about the ways in which the church and religion, and specifically Christianity, lent language and vision to these kinds of dynamic partnerships. As I stood in Sadie's backyard, I was wondering about the same kinds of relationships. What's Christianity doing? How is it framing the plantation? How is it making sacred slave cemeteries? And what is it that allows the paradox of the enslavement of human beings as pieces of chattel and property, and yet the worship of a God that says all are one in Christ Jesus? Those are all the questions that are always in my mind. The present work I am doing with slave cemeteries around the city of Charlotte continues this investigation. So what I'm sharing with you today, I think, will give some insight into Christianity and the ways in which I am leveraging that religion and the spaces of slave cemeteries as sites of mediation and peace building between community groups that have historically been separated by de facto segregation. I think my talk, though, will speak more to just Christian audiences. I think that the tools that I will offer and show will lead toward pathways of peace that can speak to people inside Christianity and those that have no relationship to Christianity, those of other religions and those who may be atheists or agnostic. I think that the tools that I will share in the next couple of minutes will be helpful if you are investigated in building peace in your communities across race and ethnicity. The kinds of tools that I will present today offer a kind of interiority of the soul that can be resilient in the face of opposition. I also talk a little bit about brain science, so I'm going to ask you to stretch halfway through my lecture to wake you up a little bit more and teach you a little bit about neuroscience, because I am combining prayer and neuroscience as a way to keep communities with each other, even in the hardest of truth-telling. So, the space where I leverage these tools are slave cemeteries. Now, I have to tell you, as a little girl, I was a little bit weird. I like to hang out at cemeteries. I thought they were the most beautiful park-like settings, and I would love to go and read all of the names on the tombstones and look at that little dash between those years and wonder what that life was like. So I'm kind of a weird person. I like cemeteries. And so it's kind of natural for me to stand in the middle of cemeteries. So how did I get to working with slave cemeteries? So as a Presbyterian minister, I preach and teach on occasion almost every Sunday, if I allow myself to, in between my university job. And a couple of Sundays over the last 20 years, I would drive up to a church lot and I would see two different cemeteries. And they would always be segregated, either by a stone or a hedge. I would go into the church office just before Sunday sermon would start, and I would say, hey, what's over behind the wall? What's over across the hedge? And they would say, oh, that's where the slaves are. One Sunday morning, I kept seeing these same kinds of segregation at another church, and they would be peppered all across the city of Charlotte. You need to know I've been preaching in Charlotte for over 20 years. And most churches in Charlotte are still segregated by de facto segregation. So when I show up at a church, it's either going to be predominantly white or black with a couple of salt and peppers of different races. And so I was used to the segregation, but I did not know that it still extended to the graveyard, and I certainly didn't know that there were slave cemeteries there. One day I went to visit a church just because I was curious about who may be in the slave cemetery. And I walked into an office, began to look at Presbyterian Church minutes. This is why I love Presbyterians, because they take down notes on everything. They are the committee of the committee. If you want to get something done, you have to just create a committee. And so as I was reading these stories, these little remnants, these little pieces of the enslaved population that were full-fledged members of Presbyterian churches, yet relegated to the balcony with less equality than those that worship with them, the white Christians, I was fascinated because, number one, when I looked into the archives, the same surnames that I saw at the white church were at the black church. I was even fascinated because sometimes I could do two Sunday services, and so sometimes I would be at the black church at the 8 a.m. service and be at the white church at the 11 a.m. service, and I would be in the church office and still see the same surnames. I began to ask more questions. And one Sunday I went into the middle of the week, and the lawn care service was out and about. And they were busy mowing the lawn around all of the very manicured section. And I wondered if they were going to go behind the wall. So I waited and waited and waited. And they never went behind the wall. And then as I began to visit other churches that had enslaved cemeteries, enslaved burial grounds, I realized that the manicure people, the people who do the lawn, they never went back there. So here I was in the 21st century, and I'm looking at segregation in living color. And I'm looking at it hidden in plain sight. There's one church that I will share with you. You need to know that in the city of Charlotte, there are actually 7 to 8, and I'll say 8 because one is teetering on the verge of not being in existence anymore. There are 7 to 8 historically white Presbyterian churches. And those 7 to 8 churches have an enslaved burial ground next to them. And 5 to 7 miles from each church, there are functioning black Presbyterian congregations that emerge from each church. Now, when the Presbyterians in Charlotte get together for what you call a presbytery meeting, that means when you have representatives from all churches come around and sit together and do Presbyterian polity and make judgments, you will see black and white Presbyterians sit together. Now that's on a Tuesday or a Saturday morning. On Sunday, they're back in their separate churches. So I wanted to figure out a way, number one, to capture this history because what I was seeing, but the other way, I really wanted to figure out a way to bring these communities together because I said it's got to be more connection than just surnames. It is a popular historical fact that enslaved people did take the names of their slave masters, but some of them changed the names as well. What I was interested in the familial connections between slave owners and their descendants. I was willing and a little bit hesitant to approach the churches and say, hey, would you like to connect with the black church down the street whose ancestors you enslaved? Can you imagine how that conversation went? But I was surprised because as I went to these churches, there was always a small group of people that said, you know, we've looked at our history and we want to connect with that church. We just don't quite know how to make that bridge. So as I began to work with the churches, I pulled a couple of partners with me because I knew I couldn't do this all by myself. So my poor husband, who's over there, Ricky D. Moore, Reverend Ricky D. Moore, has recently retired. And I said, as you move toward retirement, don't you want to help me work with these churches? And then I began to move in and create other partners. These partners, now let me tell you about them. They're my students in my classroom, they're fellow colleagues that are with me at the university, and they are genealogists and local historians. I ask them all to stand with me and around the congregations who are willing to work with me. And some of you might be thinking, well, she certainly might have gotten the word no occasionally. Absolutely. The very first church that I asked, would you like to discover the names of those buried in your backyard? Would you like to connect with the living descendants who your ancestors have enslaved? And they told me flat out, no. Some people just didn't answer my email or hung up on me. But there were others that said yes. So I invited those who would come with me to stand in partnership with those I had brought to stand with me. And students, teachers, genealogists, even funeral home directors that have wonderful, if they don't throw them away, histories from obituaries. They stood with me as neutral mediators between black and white communities, between the descendants of the enslaved and the enslaver, and they brought their skills, their language, and their community around these church communities, and they began to work. The first thing I like to do with the mediators, not the communities that I work with, but the people who will stand with me to do the work, are those who will come with me to the enslaved burial ground. I ask them to stand with me and get quiet in the midst of the site so that they can hear the ground, so that they can hear the wind through the trees, tell of the souls buried beneath the earth. My invitation to them is to step upon the slave cemetery and recognize a sacred call to mark the unmarked, to provide language, design, and meaning for both black and whites. And I also ask them to help black and white congregations who have this shared church history and connection to slavery to envision a future of unity together. So Presbyterians are very good at Thanksgiving and Martin Luther King Day. They always like to do pulpit swaps. Then after that, everybody goes back to their own corner. And I said, no, I want you to envision ways in which communities come together, reckon with the truth, but also get to know one another, build relationship. So there's one church that is featured in the film that I was able to show at the Everett Jewish Life Center, which I'm very grateful to them for. And the film features, the film is called Charlotte 7, if you haven't seen it. And the film features a church called Providence Presbyterian Church. It was established in 1767. Most of the members of Providence Presbyterian Church were the movers and shakers in the founding of Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, and many of those members were the signers of the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence, which our Constitution is modeled after. So, as I approached this church, there was a group of people who said, we've been praying for 2 years for someone like you to come and help us connect with the church down the street. The church down the street is called Matthews Merkland Presbyterian Church. And ironically, this was a black Presbyterian church established by none other than ex-Confederate soldiers, brigadier generals, and Northern Presbyterian ministers. So this was a church established by white Presbyterians to help black Presbyterians find their own ways of worship. The Providence Presbyterian Church held, remember, the ancestors of Matthews Merkland as chattel property up until 1865. In 1866, those black members tried to integrate into more substantive roles in Providence Presbyterian, but they were denied equality, and so then they began to work with ex-Confederates and those Northern Presbyterian ministers. So a little bit of background before I dig deeper into this relationship. When I began to work with these two churches and I began to notice the same surnames, as I was driving to them, I recognized that the city streets that I was driving down had the same name. I would go by high schools, and the high schools would have the same surname. I would even look at local YMCAs, and they would have the same surname. And it occurred to me that one can drive through the city of Charlotte and notice hospitals, educational institutions, and churches with the names like Alexander, Kuykendall, Morris, Ross, Ray. All of these are part of the city's landscape. So now here I was, not just recognizing slave cemeteries as part of Christian landscapes, especially with Presbyterian churches. Now I was getting to recognize that the city streets and the institutions and the supermarkets and, yes, the new development with the name Plantation was all hearkening back to real-life slave owners in the institution of slavery. So once I realized this, I began to get students to write the history, but the other thing I did was try to figure out a way to keep descendants at the table. And so I want to move you to a little bit of neuroscience. So are you still with me? All right. Over my years of studying African American history and religion, I realized that the gains of the modern civil rights movement were very powerful and substantive, but they did not change the hearts of individuals toward one another. I even looked at the work of Dr. Martin Luther King and his movement of nonviolence. I read Strength to Love, I've read his autobiography, and I realized that Dr. Martin Luther King made more progress in terms of building relationships in the fight for equality and justice than the laws that he helped create. And so I was fascinated by what relationships look like between people who have historical histories where they have been in conflict or have trauma or have been oppressed. And I was looking at the ways in which I could, forgive me, circumvent the atrocities of Christianity. Because remember, in the South, Christianity was used to justify the enslavement of African and indigenous people. Christianity was used to justify and give religious theology to the dehumanization of people of color. Even scientific racism was blended with Christian language and ideology in order to shape the mindsets so that white people would look down on non-white people and have sacred and religious justification to do so. So I was looking for a way that would circumvent what was already entrenched, not only in my own denomination, but in Christianity as a whole, whether it was through Catholicism or Protestantism. Neuroscience offered this bridge, if you will. It offered a way to get through Christianity, and I was also looking at an applied form of spirituality that would help people, if you will, keep their brains and their bodies relational with those that they were predisposed to look at as other and dehumanized. I was looking at the ways in which spirituality could be leveraged. So I began to look at neuroscience and prayer, a particular kind of prayer, as a way to make that bridge. These tools, I realized were powerful through a series of interactions that I'm going to share with you. So I have about 3 stories. So Matthews Merkland, the predominantly black church, and Providence Presbyterian, the predominantly white church, they knew some of them of their history, but my husband and I had worked with the communities, and we bring them together over a 8 to 9 month period. And they sit in a room together around a table, and we present histories, but we also get them to look at the designs that students have made, and we also ask them to think about letters of hope and forgiveness. One particular day, we got news that a church fire had happened at Matthews Merkland, the black church. When I contacted the pastor, he said that there was an arsonist that had burned the church, and they were not sure whether that arsonist was a white supremacist. You need to know that back in the 1990s, Matthews Merkland was burned to the ground by a person that they thought was part of the Ku Klux Klan, but turned out to be a person who just wanted to use racist language to justify the burning of the church. And so the members sat around the table, and each church member remembered the 1990s event, and they also remembered where they are now with looking at the way the enslaved populations were buried. You need to know that they had just gotten information about the ways in which the burial ground that was in the church's backyard had ground-penetrating radar done, and they thought they only had 40 enslaved human beings. And after the ground-penetrating radar was done, they realized that they had over 250. And they were buried on top of each other. They looked like they were thrown in a mass grave, and the majority of them were children. So you had that information, and you just had this church burning. When the members were gathered together, I realized that we could not do business as usual. We had to sit and talk about it. So my husband and I had been teaching them about neuroscience about how the brain works. But we also taught them to go back to the moment that they heard about the fire and pray and ask God where he was at the moment they heard it, whether they were on the phone, whether they were in the car. We saw something magnificent happen. Black people were able to stay at the table and hear white people talk about their fears, about coming into the room and thinking that the black people were going to be angry at them and lash out at them. White people were able to stay at the same table and hear the anger and frustration and even lament of the African American people and still stay together. You also need to know that many of them could look across the table and see some of the surnames of those who had enslaved their ancestors. So prayer and neuroscience was working. So let me tell you a little bit about neuroscience because I only have about 8 minutes left. I'm hoping. Okay. So, neuroscience. It is important to understand that our brains work through joy. Now, joy is not happenings or when you feel happy about something. Joy is looking at someone and looking at their face, especially the eyes, and knowing that they are glad to be in the room with you. And I'm pretty sure if I take you back to an argument you've had, you can tell that someone says, oh, it's fine, but everything in their body is telling you it's not fine, right? Neuroscience says that the brain works on joy, and that when the brain does not work on joy, the 6 big emotions, disgust, anger, fear, hopeless despair, all of those will work in your amygdala and literally shut the right hemisphere of your brain down. So every time you're in an argument with someone and they kind of snap on you, that means that you're only talking to a person with half a brain operating at the moment. Their left brain is verbal and intellectual, and they're only working with a little bit of what that person has told you. But when your right brain is fully operational, your right brain starts out with those who are attached to you, with those who are attuning to you, and they literally turn on your prefrontal right cortex. We believe in our work with descendant communities who have ancestors that were enslaved by the other communities. We believe that brain science and prayer go hand in hand. And we have trained our people to, number one, notice how their brains work. We teach them the operations of the brain. We teach them brain skills on how to quiet themselves when they are feeling overwhelmed or triggered by anger or trauma histories and memories. And then we teach them how to engage the presence of God. Now, for those of you who may not be Christians, we offer the presence of peace. Because for some people, Jesus is very complicated, and we can't sometimes even use Jesus. And sometimes we present the presence of peace. I heard her timer go off, so I am going to do my conclusion.
You're fine.
I'm fine. That's great. That's great. All right. I could tell you a little bit more. What informs the brain science is the work of James E. Wilder and another person called Alan Shore, and attachment theory, if you want to do a little bit more digging. So here's my conclusion. As a case study analysis on how brain and applied spirituality of a prayer practice that I call the Emmanuel approach, where we invite God into trauma memories only first by starting with a moment of appreciation and then quieting ourselves and then moving from appreciation into trauma memories and then back into peaceful thoughts or appreciation, we have found that our communities have built and developed emotional capacity to stay with each other even as they are hearing horrific stories connected to slavery and abuses and oppression. I believe scholars engaging in conflict studies to build peace and unity across the world, as well as activists, counselors, and spiritual leaders of all faith, must take into account how human brains process trauma and respond emotionally to others who symbolically represent a literal enemy or an embodied enemy other. Moral cause for equity, equality, right behavior between divided cultures, while helpful and needed, will not alleviate emotional trauma, nor sufficiently build sustainable measures of unity between warring factions. Peace builders, whether in the academy or on the front lines, must address the emotional systems of human brains and understand the neurobiology of essential right brain processes, which are often non-conscious and affect regulation. For racially diverse Christian communities we work with, the neurotheological insights have been particularly helpful. We observed that when we bring prayer and knowledge of the brain, that individuals are enabled to walk in agape love, the kind of love that Dr. Martin Luther King argued. We believe that if Americans decided to take seriously the neuroscience of their brains and the faith practices of prayer modalities that help them process trauma memories, they can build a new kind of community. One that can argue and still stay at the table. One that can be argumentative and combative and yet still be in relationship with one another. However, if we neglect this, then all talks about racial healing, racial conciliation, ethnic tribalism, and all of that, and alleviating any kind of conflict will be null and void. I'll say this because my work, ironically, has garnered the attention of people in the Global Center for Pluralism that work with the members of the Aga Khan who do peace building around the world. I've been asked to go to Montreal and Quebec and talk to people who are leaders in the Abrahamic Accords and solidarity talks between Palestinians and people of Israeli descent. I've even been asked to go to indigenous populations and speak to a number of indigenous groups, and what they are most interested in is not necessarily the ways in which I'm doing history about slavery, but how we are keeping descendants of the enslaved and slaver together. And so, ironically, and with my husband, we've almost gone around the world really talking to people about the usefulness of brain science and prayer as a way to build peace. I think slave cemeteries across America can potentially be the mediation ground that neuroscience and prayer can begin to bring truth-telling and a fuller conversation that America has yet to have about its history with slavery. I thank you for your time. I hope we have some wonderful discussions.
First question we have. How do you think that the differences of worship, music, art, architecture, it jumped on me, where am I at? Got more questions coming in, sorry about that, it just moved. Well, It decided to disappear. Well, look, I'll find that one. Hang on. Here we go. Okay, let's start over. How do you think that the differences in worship, music, art, architecture, rituals, etc., in predominantly white versus black churches has contributed to historical and ongoing segregation in the church?
That's an interesting question. Let's talk about balconies for a minute. So architecturally, balconies were created for enslaved populations. And I can look at a couple of historical moments where there are church splits among Presbyterians in the city of Charlotte over whether the music was played on the downbeat or the upbeat. And I can also look at church splits over whether hymns were sung directly from Scripture or whether they were outside of Scripture and just said something like God is love and added other tunes. And so I think in terms of how these things contributed to African American oppression or just more segregation, I kind of have to disagree with the implications of the question, because African Americans in the city of Charlotte, for example, did not leave churches immediately. You had a sort of waves of walkouts. And so for them, I'll say those that decided to stay at Providence Presbyterian Church until, let's say, the 1880s or even the 1920s, because members are on the rolls until that, they were fine with the music. They believed in the words of the hymn. It is not until they are forcibly moved out that they begin to move into predominantly white Christian organization and realize that they can bring their African heritage and rhythms more fully into the worship. But they had hopes of seeing a bridge and of integrating that into their worship life.
What is one of the buried enslaved person that you were able to find their name or any information about them? First question. Second part of that is, has finding their story helped make connection? It
has. There's one family. So there's a street in Charlotte called Ray Road. And Ray Road was owned by the Rays, who were lucrative plantation owners. And the one member of Matthews Merklin Presbyterian Church was looking for her ancestors, heard rumors that her ancestors were enslaved by a member at Providence. Through a oral history research interview that I did, I was able to bring those descendants together, and they discovered a lost ancestor and discovered where she was buried, and also discovered that they were related biologically. And from then on out, the Ray family invited this other family named Doris Jones Boyd to the family reunion. So for the first time in over 150 years, the Ray family invited the Boyd family to join them, black and white, together. And I have pictures of that. Another person is Amanda Greer. Amanda Greer's birthday and death date are recorded in Providence Presbyterian Church's minutes, which is highly unusual. You hardly ever find birth dates for enslaved people. Amanda Greer turned out to be the first African-American woman doctor. She was employed in Atlanta, Georgia, and unfortunately her grave has now been run over by a highway, 277, due to Charlotte's urban renewal.
Can you speak to the mammy relationship that many older Southerners have?
Yes. So when we do prayer moments, when we ask our communities to look at memories from their past that have racialized colors or tints to those memories. And you need to know that for the first 6 to 7 months, we work with communities separately in order for them to build brain skills and capacity. When we work with predominantly white communities, one of the racial memories that has come up, because most of our communities are 50 years old and older, they always go back to a black domestic worker that they had a love attachment to. And even though the mammy image is very pejorative and negative, black domestic workers who were not mammies per se, but were given that by oppressive white structures of language. But these were black domestic workers that built love bonds and mother bonds with the children that they were entrusted to raise. When we ask individuals who are in predominantly white communities to go back to memories of race, there's lots of pain about the ways in which they watched how their black domestic workers were treated. And there is also an awakening for them to realize that even though that person was a part of their family's employment, that they also loved them and that race was present in the family. And so we help them process what it meant to have witnessed that black domestic worker being called a racist word or being beaten or being abused, and how that affected them and how that may be affecting how they understand race. One of the most beautiful things that came out of that was one minister, it was a minister, decided to go back and find the grave of the black domestic worker that had raised him. And he found the grave and cleaned it up, and because it had been overrun, and contacted the family. So there are ways in which this work is building bridges in unexpected ways. So.
Fantastic. Were there any white clerical leaders involved with your efforts to help reconcile relationships between the white and the black church communities?
So I would say yes, but from a distance. Predominantly white churches that we ask to participate, we ask those ministers, number one, to support us, but number two, to choose individuals in their congregations, at least 5 to 6, who are willing to walk the road of truth and peace in hand with African American people. There are some people that they have chosen that did not want to do it, and there are some. There's always a remnant that is willing. One of those remnants, we did their history, and they descended from a grand wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. But that descendant is working steadily with us and the African American descendants in order to create a new kind of unity.
This is a bit of praise and question. I love your approach. Trauma underlines so much of continuing conflict, and the neuroscience coming out is a greater promise of healing. There are many negative and forgotten black and enslaved cemeteries in the North, too. Have any of your communities also used genetic analysis to confirm their relationships?
So, great question. There are many of my communities that have asked, once the historical research has been done and presented and triangulated with ground penetrating radar, they have asked those descendants of slave owners to do DNA testing. Some have said yes, and some have said no. The ones that have said no are usually still struggling with shame or fear. And those that have said yes have already processed what their ancestors have done. They understand that it was inherited into them, and they are seeking to do something different by reaching across the divide and enlarge their family systems. So 50-50 in terms of that.
During our current moment in history where less people are going to church, how do you think religious institutions can still build bridges?
So one of the things about Christianity, even though I'm very critical of it at times, is the message of Jesus Christ and his actions of love and forgiveness. And I think that Christian institutions, even though they might be declining in membership, I think the message of Jesus Christ is still pretty much out there. It might not be behind those 4 church walls and the steeple, but that message is still there. And even non-Christians, if they just want to look at what it means to walk in nonviolence and peace, they can look at the actions of Christ forgiving the enemy, blessing the enemy, which is what Dr. Martin Luther King called members to do. I think that can still offer language and vision and approach to peace building. Now, the other side of that is you have to have built neural capacity, meaning that you have to have a brain that has trained itself to come back to relationality and be at peace from emotions like anger, disgust, fear, hopeless despair. There are so many times where Christianity and the messages of Christ or even Dr. Martin Luther King have been put out there, and people go out there without the emotional capacity and resiliency to stay at the table and to be in the face of danger.
In light of the fact that enslaved people were often forced to convert to Christianity, how does that interest with your word with congregations? Mm-hmm. What is it? Intersect. Okay.
Okay. So on an enslaved burial ground, even today, so Providence, remember, established in 1767, so that burial ground is very old. When we do cemetery cleanups, and I train people how to properly clean up a cemetery, we find bottles that are inverted, we find seashells, we find broken glass. Bottles were to ward away evil spirits. Shells were sometimes used as transaction or passageway for the dead ancestor to go back to Africa. Bricks with enslaved fingerprints on them are a way to mark them. So the history of African American religion as it migrated in the African diaspora is very much present at enslaved burial grounds. And so that work and that history, that religious worldview, that cosmology, if you will, is always there. And so I think that Christianity, as African Americans embraced Jesus Christ, they also kept part of their ancestral lineage of connecting back to Africa and acknowledging the presence of the ancestors. And we see remnants of that with those kind of markers on graves.
Okay, we have just about time for 1 or 2 more. What's your dream for how your work on reconciliation can grow?
Okay, so what if all of you, just this small group of people here, and maybe those online who are looking, right? What if all of you decided to go to your hometown or where your cities are and look at enslaved burial grounds and then find groups that are willing to work with you, not just to memorialize and mark it, but to begin to have a conversation with communities about what their future could look like together. I think slave cemeteries, we are doing memorialization, we're raising money to create memorials. Those memorials are a tangible representation of how Black and white people overcame the past, reckoned with their history, and envisioned a new future together. What if Americans decided to do that all across the country? And more than that, what if each of them decided to begin to educate themselves on the ways in which their brains work, how they can read their bodies when they're getting ready to be overwhelmed, and how they can create emotional resiliency, not just to be at the table with those that they call enemy, but with family members at Thanksgiving or Christmas, or with bosses and people in their lives. What if prayer was central to every conversation, where if you felt yourself become overwhelmed, you quiet and pause and ask for a power greater than yourself to come in and help you process so that you can stay in relationship with those who are around you. Yes, my dream is that the city of Charlotte would have 7 memorials, but those memorials would be tangible reminders of what it means for people of different ethnicities and races to come together and envision a peace-filled future together with the help of neuroscience and prayer as those center tools.
Last, I have a friend. I have a friend in Charlotte who is an African-American genealogist, librarian, and writer. She found her white cousins through Ancestry.com. Is this technology a tool of reconciliation or basically not, or tension?
So both. I would say that I use, in my students who do the research on these church families and groups, use Ancestry.com. But when we present the history, when we present the truth, we are not there to shame and blame the enslaver or their descendants. We are there to tell the truth, and we are there to ask the descendants of the enslaver and the enslaved, what can they do with this history that they inherited, that some of them are still facing the legacies of, and how they can work together to build a more equitable kind of relationship. And so that's a different way of presenting that your ancestor or your great-great-grandfather owned 50 enslaved human beings and sold them away. We tell the truth, but we also say, this is a history that was inherited. You're sitting across the table from a descendant who was part of that history. What can you do together to envision a new kind of unity together? That's different than just laying it out and saying, I'm blaming you for it. And we do all of those conversations pausing with the presence of God in those conversations.
One quick one. We've had desegregation to bring people together and to have equality. We have finding your roots so people can see your line of ancestry. And yet we seem bent on both sides, many, locked into a kind of segregation in the places we can be segregated, in our minds, in our homes, in our neighborhoods. When those people that are dug in and determine that either we don't belong here or you owe us an apology for what happened, how do you reach those people in your model and your ideas?
So we are on the frontier of that, but I will say that those particular people always need community around them. What the tendency is for those that are trying to build unity and reconciliation or conciliation, when they look at those people that say, you owe me an apology, or I don't want to have anything to do with you, we tend to say, well, we'll just ignore them, or we'll just separate ourselves. But we call our communities to stand with them and to stay in conversation with them. But we also say you have to build enough capacity to stay with the person who says, I don't want to have anything to do with this. Why are you bringing up the past? Or I'm so angry. You just need to give me an apology, or you need to give me reparations, and you need to give it right now. I think without relationship and relationality, those conversations will always stalemate. But when you start building relationship and you bring other communities who are willing to stand with you, then now you are building a kind of space and a middle ground for more things to change.
Thank you. One other person wanted to know, will you be doing anything else here on the grounds while you're here? Any other speaking or talks in private places? They'd like to know if you're going to still be here.
So I will be here till Friday morning. And I'm not doing any other public speaking, but I'd totally be open to having conversations with you, our walks around this. This is my first time in Chautauqua, and it's wonderful. And I'd just love to meet more of you and have conversations, and also have you talk with my husband and I. I couldn't do this without him, and so he is my project manager and everything else. And so talking with us together would be really fruitful. So.
Thank you, Julia, Dr. Julia Robinson Moore.